welcome to the Bioenergetics of Mixed Martial Arts. I'm Dr. Jason Gillis. So we're over halfway through this course now, and in the first half you learned a lot of the basics. You learned how to convert food into energy, and specifically ATP. You learned how to generate ATP anaerobically with the ATP-PCr system and anaerobic glycolysis, and aerobically with aerobic energy metabolism. And in the last session we learned about aerobic fitness and your VO2 max. This session we're going to focus on your anaerobic threshold, and if it's not something you've heard of, you should know exactly what it is by the end of this session. And after that we're going to move on and get really applied. We're going to talk about low and high intensity endurance training and how to train a specific energy system. I think you're going to like that session. We're going to focus on periodization, and then we're going to ultimately conclude this course by talking about how to develop endurance in mixed martial arts. So this is session 6, all about your anaerobic threshold. Learning objectives for you. Number 1, I want you to be able to define the anaerobic threshold and understand what it is. And I want you to be able to understand the relationship between your anaerobic threshold and mixed martial arts performance. So this is what we're going to cover. 2 simple things. We're going to talk about your anaerobic threshold, give it a definition, show you some figures, draw some pictures. And then we're going to compare it to performance. So what is your anaerobic threshold? Well, you may have heard it by a different name. Some people call it the lactate threshold. But basically it's the point at which blood lactate accumulation increases pretty sharply. So when this happens, it's indicative of a certain energy system. And I'm sure that you should be able to guess what that is, because what energy system is responsible for lactic acid production? You should be saying anaerobic glycolysis. So when you start to see a buildup of lactic acid in the blood, then that's indicative of activation of the anaerobic glycolytic energy system. So what you're seeing there is lactate production increasing and increasing and increasing, and lactate clearance isn't able to match that. So what it really reflects, what the anaerobic threshold really reflects, is the interaction of aerobic and anaerobic energy systems, and it's a really good indicator for your potential for endurance exercise, and I think it's a pretty good indicator for your performance in the cage as well. And what I'd like to do is just draw a little picture for you so you know exactly what we're talking about. So I'm just going to go and bring up a little chalkboard here. Let's start by just drawing some axes here. I'm just going to put a vertical axis there, and then we're going to put a horizontal axis going over here. And let's call this horizontal, or this vertical axis, blood lactate concentration. So blood lactate concentration. And if you didn't know, that is measured in millimoles per diluted liter of blood. And if you want to put some numbers to it, we can do that. Let's start off at 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. It can go much higher than 10. I've seen concentrations upwards of 20 or so sampled in some papers, and it can get pretty high when you're working maximally. On this bottom axis, then let's call this treadmill speed. And so we're just going to pretend that you're running on the treadmill here. So let's start, this is going to be kilometers an hour, so we'll start 4, 6, 8, 10 kilometers an hour, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20 kilometers per hour. So let's say that you get on the treadmill and then you start running at 4 kilometers per hour. And so what's going to happen, and this is going to be different for everybody, but what will happen over time is as you increase your speed, then if we took samples, every so often, what we'd start to see is a slow increase in the amount of lactic acid or lactate in your blood. And eventually we're going to get to a point where you start to run really fast, and when you're exercising at a high intensity, then you're going to start to rely primarily on anaerobic metabolism. So down here in this range, you're really relying primarily on aerobic metabolism. But let's say for this athlete, when they get to 12 kilometers per hour, that's hard for them. They start to dip into anaerobic glycolysis. And what's the byproduct of anaerobic glycolysis? it's going to be lactic acid, right there. So you're going to start to see an increase in lactic acid concentration. So let's say we force them to keep on increasing the speed, and so the next time we take a sample, maybe it shoots up. And then we keep on having them increase the speed, and we take samples continually, and it keeps on going up. And so let's just connect the line here. So what you're seeing here is there's this point where down here they're relying on aerobic metabolism to power their movement, and then all of a sudden they get to this sort of critical point, and for this athlete it just happens to be around 12 kilometers per hour when they're running on a treadmill, where they start to dip into anaerobic metabolism. Specifically, this is anaerobic glycolysis happens right here, and as a result they start to see an increase in lactic acid concentration, and so it's going to just shoot right up here. And this point where you start to get this breakaway right here, where it's going up nice and gradually and then it just shoots up, that is called your anaerobic threshold. Okay, so I hope this is a little bit more clear for you. Okay, let's get back to that lecture. Now there's going to be a relationship between the amount of lactic acid that you measure in the blood and fatigue. So the more lactic acid in your blood, the more likely it is that you'll be fatiguing. Now that kind of suggests that lactic acid is causing the fatigue, but it's not the case. That's just a correlation. It doesn't imply causation. If you remember back to that lecture that we had on anaerobic glycolysis, then you'll remember it's not the lactic acid. It's the buildup of hydrogen ions and inorganic phosphate from the rapid breakdown of ATP and anaerobic glycolysis that's causing the fatigue. So what you really want to do as a fighter is increase your anaerobic threshold so that you're able to work at a high intensity aerobically, not dipping into anaerobic metabolism, specifically anaerobic glycolysis. So you want to try to elevate your anaerobic threshold so you can sustain a higher intensity, and that's going to translate into better MMA performance. So let's try to explain this a different way. What I'm trying to say is your anaerobic threshold is an excellent predictor of MMA performance. So if you had two athletes, let's take you and one of your training partners, and you have the exact same VO2 max. Maybe it's very, very high. Maybe it's like 85 milliliters per kilogram per minute, which is very, very high. The person who has the higher lactate threshold will be able to perform at a higher intensity, and they will fatigue after the person who has a lower lactate threshold. So normally your lactate threshold or your anaerobic threshold, we use those terms interchangeably, they're expressed as a percentage of your VO2 max. In untrained males, it's going to happen around 50 to 60% of their VO2 max. But with training, you can increase the lactate threshold up to 75 or even 90% of your VO2 max. So what that means is for the individual who's untrained, they're going to be starting to dip into their anaerobic metabolism or anaerobic glycolysis at around 50% of their VO2 max. Whereas the person who's trained, they're not going to start to dip into anaerobic glycolysis until they're somewhere around 75 or even 90% of their VO2 max. So they can work at a much higher intensity without relying on anaerobic metabolism and the buildup of all those byproducts that can cause fatigue. Let's see if we can draw the link between anaerobic threshold and performance a little more clearly. So what we're looking at here on the left side of this figure is your percent VO2 max. And on the horizontal axis, we're looking at repeated maximal efforts. So let's say you're in training and there's a group of you and your coach says, okay, we're going to do some pickups and takedown attempts on a dummy, and we're going to do 9 or 10 of them. So you go ahead, and maybe you're an average trained individual and you're not using much oxygen on that first one. Your muscles are using a little more oxygen on the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one, all the way to the end, and I think there's 9 attempts here. So by the time you get to that 9th pickup and takedown, then you're going to be at your VO2 max. And let's say, for example, that your VO2 max is 100 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So we're going to say that you're an average male and your anaerobic threshold happens at about 50 to 60% of your VO2 max. So if your VO2 max is 100 milliliters per kilogram per minute, by the time you get to 50 to 60% of your VO2 max, then you're going to start dipping into anaerobic metabolism. So by the time you get to around the 4th or 5th attempt here, then you're going to start to see a sharp increase of lactate in your blood, and you're going to start to experience some fatigue. Let's contrast that with the most fit individual in the group. But let's say that they have the exact same VO2 max as you, except they have a higher anaerobic threshold. Their anaerobic threshold is 75 to 90% of their VO2 max. So again, same VO2 max measured in milliliters per kilogram per minute between you and them. It's both around 100. But their anaerobic threshold is much higher. So you start to experience fatigue on around the 4th or 5th repetition. They don't start to experience fatigue until the 7th or 8th repetition. So what does that mean? They're able to exercise at a higher intensity for each of those pickups and takedown attempts. So my question is, who would you rather be? Well, of course, you're going to want to have a higher anaerobic threshold. So I hope this helps to explain why you want to really try to elevate your anaerobic threshold. It's really a pretty big factor that influences your performance in the cage. Okay, so let's give you a summary here. The anaerobic threshold is the point when lactate starts to build sharply in your blood. And it's indicative of anaerobic metabolism, specifically anaerobic glycolysis. And you're going to see that big, sharp increase in lactate in your blood, and that's going to be associated with a buildup of hydrogen ions and inorganic phosphate that causes fatigue. It's normally expressed as a percentage of your VO2 max. You want to increase your anaerobic threshold because that's going to cause an increase in performance. And really what that does is that allows you to exercise harder whilst relying on aerobic metabolism, and it's really a great predictor of MMA performance. So again, here's some references, you can dig into those. But that's it for this lecture. I hope you learned something about the anaerobic threshold, and we're going to go on and we're going to get really applied from now on. So I look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture. Take care.